Hello everyone, welcome back to MOA Live Talks, and I'm Dr. Heather Hatch again. I am just going to see if I can drop a quick link to our donation page into the video here. So we have been doing these live talks for a couple of weeks now. We've also been doing our Katie's been doing the kids crafts. I think we've dropped back on both of those. So this week we're doing crafts on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and live talks on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And this is really meant to sort of help us, since the museum's not able to be open right now, we're not able to engage with people who might be interested in our materials, and it also means that we're not able to offer our kids camps or our school groups and all that stuff. So we're down some revenue. It's hitting everyone, and we would really appreciate it if anybody who has been watching these live streams, who are interested in what we're doing with this, with these talks and so forth, if you would be willing, just a second, I am doubling myself. All right, if you would be willing to just maybe drop us even just a few dollars, I am just going to drop the link onto the comments there, and it's really, if you're looking for it, it's that yellow donate button right in the middle of the page will take you to our PayPal. And like I said, we would very much appreciate anything you might be able to toss our way. And once again, I have my setup here so I can see any comments that come up, and if anybody has any questions about archaeobotany, I will try my very hardest to answer them. So I am not an expert in archaeobotany. I did ask a couple of archaeobotanists that I know, so thanks go to Ruth Dickow and Brianne Reibel, who both looked over my outline for this and told me whether or not I was missing anything. So thank you to both of them for their advice and input, and hopefully I won't be missing anything major, and I won't misinform anybody too badly for this. But again, if you have questions, please drop them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them, and if I don't know the answer, I will get back to you after I consult with somebody who's got a little bit more expertise. So then, moving into our actual talk, then what is archaeobotany? So archaeo referring, of course, to archaeology, so we're still looking at the study of past peoples, and then botany, of course, being the study of plants. So archaeobotany is the study of past peoples using plants, or really the preserved remains of plants. So when we're talking about that, what does preserve? So Katie and I have both spent some time talking about how organic material, which really is most plant material, doesn't tend to preserve very well in archaeological contexts, and that's generally the truth. So there are some conditions where you can get organic preservation, but it's pretty rare. It needs to be have low oxygen, so sometimes wet sediments or things that are wet or have been buried. One example is privies, so again, like old toilet shafts, which really might be worth their own MOA live talk. So if anybody's interested in that, or if you have any other ideas for MOA live talks that you might be interested in seeing, just drop, again, a note in the comments or on our page somewhere, and we can see what we can do. So yeah, privies can lead to good but also pretty gross organic preservation, but it does happen. One of the common ways we find organic materials preserved in the archaeological record is carbonization, so things that have been burned. So things that have been roasted, if they've been eaten around a fire maybe, or if the fire was used to dispose of trash, but also the wood that was used to make that fire itself. So carbonization preserves the structure or shape of burned materials, so they're still identifiable. And sometimes if they're charred on the outside, it can protect some organic materials on the inside as well. So wood especially can be identified based on these charred remains. So wood, different kinds of wood have different grains, have different cell structures, and looking at that under the microscope allows you to identify what kind of tree a particular piece of burned wood came from, if you have a lot of specialized education, of course. So some kinds of plants can also have materials in them like starch, for example, that leaves a residue on the pots and tools that are used to process them. And then that starch can be identified and let us know what was cooked in a particular pot or what a particular tool was used to cut or to chop or grind and so forth. Some plants also have these things in them called phytoliths. They're small silica, which is a mineral that's found in a lot of sand. It's used to make glass. They have these small silica structures. They're microscopic. And so plants absorb silica from the soil that they're in and create these little unique crystals. So they're unique to each kind of plant species. And so you can look at those under a microscope, and you can see those phytoliths and identify that those kinds of plants were in this soil or were used in this context. So maize and rice both have phytoliths, And we've actually been able to use these phytoliths to trace the changes and development in these plants over time as well. So you can see domestication, you can see the development of new strains, and the dispersal of these cultigens. Not all through phytoliths, but that is related. Pollen is also something that we can use to make plant identifications in the archaeological record, and it can be very enduring. So it usually comes into the archaeological context, record rather, of its own. So plants going through their annual cycles when they have big pollen clouds, as people with seasonal allergies will know, that can be quite abundant. It gets everywhere. And like phytoliths, pollen can be used to identify plants because it is unique to different kinds of species and different families of plants. So a lot of the time when people are looking at pollen, they're not necessarily looking for like cultural use of plants, but it's telling them about the environment that people were living in. And I'll get into that a little bit later as well. Some cool ways that we can get information about past diets specifically, including plants, that get recorded in or get into the archaeological record are, one is coprolites, so that's preserved ancient poop. So from humans, we know that not necessarily everything you eat gets completely digested, and so scientists can look for evidence of seeds and grains, for example, and then for other kinds of data also in your excrement, like proteins and DNA, that show the sorts of things that people were eating. The other one that I just learned about when I was talking to some of my expert paleobotanist friends is actually called dental calculus, so tartar and plaque that builds up on your teeth. Past peoples didn't really go to the dentist all that often necessarily. They didn't have this removed. And so we can use it to learn about what was in their mouths. So it shows sort of the bacteria that people have in their mouths that is helping with that process of digestion, and also leaves behind evidence of things that people ate that get into that plaque and tartar. So that includes dairy products are something I think that people look at quite a lot when they're looking at this sort of dental calculus, but also plant materials as well. So certain kinds of cereal grains and seeds can leave traces in the plaque on your teeth that can give people an idea of the kinds of food that you were eating. So then how do we find this material? Most of these kinds of remains aren't going to be recovered directly in the field. So you're not going to be sort of shoveling a test hole and be like, aha, look at all these seeds I found. Or even if you're just sort of hand troweling with a unit very carefully. So you might find some kinds of carbonized plant remains. So sometimes you'll find like maize, like corn cob pieces or corn kernels, for example, in Ontario. And you might find those just visually when you're going through the dirt, but a lot of them are too small. It's too difficult to differentiate, a tiny little seed. Like if you think of a plant like a raspberry, they have a lot of seeds, but they're very small. They're tough. They do preserve in archaeological context, but they're not really something you can find with the naked eye. So it has to be, you have to put in some extra effort to find these sorts of things. And there's a few ways to do this. They mostly all involve taking samples from the soil. So the most common way we do this is called flotation. So it's based on the principle that these small particles like seeds and like charred matter will float, because so they're less dense than water, they're less dense than other kinds of other things that the soil itself, rocks and so forth, that are going to all sink to the bottom, and so they can be floated to the top of water, and then that water can be sort of put through a very, very fine mesh sieve, and so you can capture even very tiny things like strawberry seeds. Like if you think about how tiny those are, but we can find those with these kinds of methods. So clearly that's not going to catch all the kinds of evidence that we talked about, for example, pollen and phytoliths, which are microscopic. So you can't really separate those just by water. They need specialized methods. So sometimes they're chemical methods that we can use to separate those from the soil. And so rather than washing them with water, they might be put through some sort of chemical like acidic mixture that's going to help pull out those elements that you want to analyze specifically. And the kinds of questions you want to ask, as always, is going to determine how you're taking your sampling. So if you're trying to get a picture of the environment, so like I said with pollen, you don't necessarily want to sample from cultural areas. So for places where people were living and working, because the kinds of plants that they were using there aren't necessarily going to give you a picture of what the environment more broadly was like. So pollen cores are often taken from very calm lakes, so the bottom of lakes. So pollen collects on the surface and then sinks every season. It sort of builds up these stratigraphic layers, like Katie has talked about, I think, in some of her talks. And you can see like the changes in pollen composition over time that gives you an idea of how an environment itself has changed. If you're trying to look at cultural plants, then you are going to want to target areas and technologies where these plants were being used and processed. So places like hearths, so fires, around where people were eating and preparing food, other areas where people were collecting or processing food. And you can also look at the tools. So I mentioned that you could analyze pottery for starch residues, but you can also look at the actual tools themselves. So like if you have a mano and metate that was used to grind corn, for example, you can look at those for starch residues and phytoliths as well. And it will show how these instruments were used to harvest and process these ancient plant materials. So there's lots of different places you can, or things you can look at to try and get an idea of plant use, even if you aren't finding like direct evidence of these organic materials that make up most of what we think of the plants. That's not going to be preserved, but there are traces that we can find. So then what can we learn from archaeobotany? I've already mentioned this to some extent, but one of the things we can learn from looking at these kinds of archaeobotanical remains is what plants existed in the ancient environment. So what was growing at the times that past peoples were living. And this can tell us, give us a picture again of environmental change over long stretches of time. So when forests change from the kinds of trees we expect in colder climates to the kinds we find in warmer climates, for example, we can get a sense of what years might have been drought years when they're very dry based on what kinds of pollen we're seeing, or when there's floods. Like we can see these kinds of events sometimes. You can also see evidence of big catastrophic events like fires, for example, looking at this kind of data. And we can look and see whether or not trees are disappearing. So if you have an area that has, from its pollen cores, has a pretty stable forest environment, and then you start to see that getting less, like you can say probably these trees are disappearing. And then if you're looking at this in the context of other kinds of archaeological remains, well, you might be able to say, well, this is a point in time where we're seeing other traces of agriculture. So maybe it's what's happening is that these trees are getting cut down to make space for agricultural fields, or maybe they're being cleared to build new towns, or to support industries like shipbuilding, for example, is an industry that uses a lot of different or a lot of wood. And so in areas where you see that, you'll also be able to see that reflected in other kinds of environmental pictures that you can build up using pollen cores and other kinds of environmental data. We can see things also like new plants being introduced to an area. For example, a lot of plants that we take for granted today as being just in the environment here in Ontario actually came to North America with colonial settlers. And we can see how they spread across the landscape, and whether or not that actually correlates with the expansion of human colonization, or whether or not the plants are spreading on their own just because they fit very well into the local environment. So we can see those sorts of things if we're looking at broad environmental patterns as well. So going all along, sort of related to this, one of the things you can see looking at plant remains is seasonality. So obviously plants are going through different cycles throughout the year, and we can see this in correlation, or we can sort of determine, correlate this kind of data with other remains. So for example, there are some kinds of plants that you can't necessarily, they just grow everywhere, even if they aren't necessarily harvested on purpose. And so for finding their pollen associated with different cultural features, we can guess that maybe those features were created at the time of year when the pollen from these particular plants was being produced. And so we can also get a sense of how people are purposefully using seasonal resources as well. So some of the things we've talked about in other live talks, sap, for example, is harvested in the spring. Berries tend to be harvested in the summer. Nuts tend to be harvested in the fall. Even agricultural produce, as we know, has seasons, which varies a lot on the local climate. And then some kinds of plants that were used for more utilitarian purposes, like to make cordage, for example, had to be harvested at particular times of year so that they could be prepared for those specific uses. So we can get a sense of when people were accessing these seasonal resources just by looking at the kinds of plants that they're using and what we know about how those plants grow. So for example, and that's true, especially if we're looking at things that don't preserve very well. So if we're looking at a small camp that's focused around, if we're looking at a small camp, for example, and we know that there's a lot of one of these particular plant resources in the area, we can guess that those resources might be like the actual reason for those encampments to be there, or at least part of it. So we can see that seasonal use, we can see what plants are people using, and these relationships with seasonal plant resources can have really important cultural connections. So in Ontario, wild rice is a really good example of this important seasonal plant use, because it's a very important cultural plant to some of the First Nations that are still here today. So then looking at people were using, how people were using plants can be really complicated. So it isn't always like very obvious what those relationships are. So not all plants leave the kinds of remains that we can detect, and we're never really going to have a full picture of those relationships. And then sometimes people just weren't using them, or they weren't preparing them in a way that allows them to be preserved, or that we can't see them as well in the archaeological record. So we know that squash was a major a significant agricultural product for a lot of First Nations that were practicing agriculture here, like around 500 years ago or so. But squash itself, it's not a very starchy food, and any of the phytoliths that we get from starch tends to be in the rind, which is not a part that gets into context where it's going to be preserved. So we don't find as much evidence of squash. It's definitely there, we find the seeds, but in terms of some of these other lines of evidence, it's harder to see. So we have to be aware that we're never going to have a full picture of the plant use of past peoples, even though we have all these multiple different lines of evidence. So then moving along from that, we want to talk about like where plants come from. That's kind of interesting too. So we talked about seasonal access, and that's a big deal for local plants, but materials can also be traded. So people aren't necessarily only relying on plants that they can get in their local area. So there are some articles going around early last year about quinoa being found in an archaeological site in Ontario. Now, this isn't really the same kind of quinoa that you're buying in the grocery store today, which excuse me, which comes down from South America, but it is a related plant. It's called Chenopodium burlandieri. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was grown in eastern North America, and it was a domesticated plant product that people were using. So it was really neat to find this plant in Ontario. But from everything I've seen, the consensus is not that people were necessarily growing it here, but that it had been traded in from some of these other cultural groups in Eastern North America. So we do find these kinds of chenopods growing all over the place, and today they're really considered more of a weed than anything, but that really just means it's a plant that's adapted well to its environment. So the existence of these plants can tell us a little bit about how people might have been using past resources. Although in this case, we don't actually have evidence that this particular Chenopodium was being domesticated or cultivated here, but it was certainly, apparently, there were contexts where people were using it here anyway. Another slightly more modern example is a coconut husk that was found in some of the 19th century archaeological contexts in Toronto, such as at the Ward, the big project that's being done around the new courthouse building, and also the excavations that were done at Bishop's Block. They found some coconut husks there. So coconut is obviously something that we can't even grow locally, but there was a market for it here. And so, I mean, maybe that's an evidence of people who were coming from different cultures that where coconut was a more important food or cultural product. But it also could just be a reflection, excuse me, of the changing cultural tastes in this big cosmopolitan city that was 19th century Toronto. I mean, and it could be both as well. So again, we can see these plant remains that tell us these different kinds of stories about people in the past. And sometimes we do see plants that have been grown in one particular area being spread to new areas. So that's not happening with coconut. You're not going to be able to get it to grow very well in southern Ontario. But we have seen these plants that are being able to bred to be adapted into new environments. So maize is really the classic example of this in North America. So we know it was domesticated down in South America, down Mexico ways. And then it spread further and further north as people were developing new varieties that could withstand colder winters and shorter growing seasons. So First Nations in Ontario cultivated many different varieties of maize, and also beans and squash and sunflowers, which were all introduced to into Ontario rather, as well as tobacco was another important product. Even though it was not a food product, it was introduced and it had important cultural significance for the people who lived here. And so when we talk about domestication, like they talk about the domestication of maize and these other plants, what does that really mean? So if I look, I stole a technical definition for you off of Wikipedia for domestication, which is that domestication is a sustained, multi-generational relationship in which one group of organisms, humans in this case, assumes a significant degree of influence over the reproduction and care of another group. So in this case, whatever plants you're... Okay, I promise I don't have COVID. It's just allergies. I swear. Responding to a comment there. But where was I? So yes, one group of organisms assumes a significant degree of influence over the reproduction and care of another group to secure a more predictable supply of resources from that second group. So, you know, we've got humans are putting in this they're building this multi-generational relationship with these plants to ensure that those resources continue to endure for them. So it's actually, like, what domestication really means can be complicated, because there's a lot of nuance between what a wild plant is and what a domesticated, even using that definition that I just gave you, is. So people can encourage the propagation, so the spread of a plant species, without necessarily altering it, so that they ensure that those resources are remaining. So it can have that that multi-generational relationship, for example, but you're not necessarily directly influencing that reproduction in the same sense. And you're not, like, you're trying to maybe make sure that those resources are there, but you're not really, it's not the same sense that, like with maize, you know, it started off as like a little tiny grass seeds almost, and it grew into these big kernels of corn, like, that are quite sizable on their own that people can eat. But you're not necessarily always going to have that level of change on the plants that you're working with. So, for example, if you're moving some raspberry canes closer to where you live, is that really domestication? Like, just because you're moving them closer to where you can access them, maybe you're cutting them back a little bit so they grow better from year to year and they're going to fruit for you better. Is that really domestication? Are those plants still wild? What if you know that there's a kind of plant that you want, and so you want to just make more of the spaces where it likes to grow? So maybe it likes to be in disturbed soil, so you might cut down, clear some brush maybe to make it, help it grow a little bit better. Is that domestication? Or if you weed out some less useful plants that are around it, does that count? Or if you cut back some trees so that there's more light, make some more space around it so that the plants are having fewer other demands on the resources so that they can grow better, produce more nuts, for example, in the cases of nut-bearing trees. But also, what happens if you go about it the other way around? So there's all kinds of examples in London, where I live, of sort of abandoned orchards. So a lot of the parks, a lot of the trail systems sort of go along these sort of abandoned orchard areas where there's all these apple trees especially that nobody's really tending anymore. So they're still there. They still produce fruit, but the fruit that they're producing, because they're not really getting cared for anymore, isn't really the sort of thing that necessarily you would look at and say, that looks like a delicious, tasty apple. It looks kind of like gnarled and there's bugs in it, and then maybe they're smaller. So is that no longer a domesticated tree? Or is it wild? Like, those relationships just in general can be complicated to sort of draw a line between. So there's also some nuances here when we're talking about the differences between foraging, so which is gathering naturally available materials, and the sort of and tending to natural resources, like stands of food producing nuts, like I was saying, to gardening or to full agricultural production, where you're changing a whole landscape, so for cutting down a forest, for example, creating large crop fields, to commit to growing plants for harvest. So there's some nuances in that too, like, you know, what is agriculture, what is just gathering, like it's not necessarily a clear-cut line between these things, and people's relationships to the plants and how they go about getting plant resources for food and for other purposes can be very complex. But we can see those changing relationships and their effects on both the plants and on people over time. So in terms of the plants, we can see those, like I was saying with corn, you can see how it physically changes the plant over time. With people, you can see that reflected in their diets, like how that impacts like how they're growing, how tall are people, how healthy are those. So those are things that are influenced by the diet, which can be plant related, obviously. So I have talked quite a lot about food plants, but it's important to recognize that plants were used for a lot more than just food by different past peoples. So some could serve multiple purposes, and different parts of a plant could be used for different things, or even have different purposes depending on how they're prepared. So for example, maybe you can eat the leaves, but it can also be applied topically as a medicine, or it could be brewed as a medical tea. It can be used as a dye. Maybe the roots can be used as a different kind of medicine. Maybe even the stalks can be used to make textiles or cordage, and that is all an example that comes from your common stinging nettles, which is another plant that's seen today really as kind of a weed. It's not something that most people want to cultivate. Is there sorry, I just got a comment here that I'm going to respond to. Is there an archaeobotany area at the MOA? So we do have a reference collection of archaeobotanical materials that does get used by some archaeologists in the area. So we have a collection of seeds and charred wood for a comparative analysis is what we have there. But we don't currently have a display about archaeobotany. Even if the galleries was accessible, that's not something we have up at the moment. I think there is an older post on our blog that talks a little bit about environmental archaeology that goes into some of this stuff that I'm talking about now, but I don't think we have anything that's dedicated at this point. But we do have the comparative collection that does get used. So that is what we have. Right, continuing along then, I was talking about plant uses. So we know that plants are known to have medicinal value, and they can be collected and tended and grown for those purposes. Wood also has a lot of different uses, so it could be used for firewood, for all kinds of construction. Some plants had also utilitarian purposes and could be used to make functional objects like baskets, like cordage I've mentioned before, textiles also. And some of them were just pretty. But even saying that a plant is just pretty is kind of a loaded when you break that down. So cultivating plants for their beauty is a culturally meaningful act, and it absolutely speaks to human relationships with the world. So gardening, like creating a flower garden or a landscaped garden, is about creating a curated natural space and experience, and it's as much about the act of gardening as it is about a finished product, if you can really say the garden is ever finished. So it's a huge industry today. And we go from all the gardening centers and the nurseries that are producing plants and seeds for people to put in their gardens. We have magazines and blogs and even whole TV shows that are dedicated to talking about like how the best ways to grow certain kinds of plants, what different fashions are in gardening, like how you would make certain adaptations for particular environments, like what growing zone you're in, and all this huge industry. And it's, if something as simple as planting flowers because they're pretty, it's such a huge cultural investment. Imagine what it meant for people to adapt like whole new food systems or introduce whole new crops, maybe first by trade and by trying some small scale food gardens, and then extending those to create large fields of food that are a major part of your diet. So just think about the sort of mental changes that have to go along with that, like and how impactful that would be for a people. Or think about how changing environments can impact what plants are available locally, and what kinds of impact that would have on people who rely on and who have cultural relationships with seasonal plant resources. So when we're looking at plant remains from archaeological contexts, we might not be able to see directly all this cultural meaning that's embedded in their use, that explain how this particular seed or nut husk or charred wood got to be wherever it is that we found it in that archaeological feature. But seeing it in those contexts is a clue that meaning is there. And archaeobotany can really help us piece those clues together, especially when we take that with other lines of archaeological evidence. And to help us sort of explain and understand what that meaning might have been, or other ways that people of the past were impacted by their relationships with these plants, wherever they may have come from. So that is my brief intro to archaeobotany. Thank you very much for following it along. Again, if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I will see you again on Thursday, where I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some local London archaeology. I haven't 100% picked what site I'm going to talk about yet, but there are several around to choose from. I'm thinking I might talk about the Norton site, but I'm not completely committed. And join me on Thursday at 1 o'clock, and you can find out with me too. So thanks again.